So this slide about lung dynamics, I talked a little bit about this last time, but maybe didn't write enough about it. So what I want to review here is that if we are talking about, I'll try to draw a decent looking lung here with the bronchial tree and all that. It's getting bad already. But if here's the lung, each surface of your lung on the outside and the inside has a particular fluid that's supposed to be associated with it. So on the outer surface of the lung, you ought to have something called serous fluid. So you would have this little layer of fluid out here, and the serous fluid is supposed to connect the lung to your chest cavity. So if you imagine the lung being about as thin as plastic wrap, which lung tissue is quite thin, and there is liquid, and then there's another surface, plastic wrap will stick with the liquid onto the surface, and they're quite hard to separate. So this characteristic, what that's going to do is allow cavity expansion to expand lungs. So when your diaphragm contracts and moves down, you're making your chest cavity wall expand, and the serous fluid is sticking that to the outer surface of the lung, and it will also expand. So that's the connection between moving the muscle, enlarging the chest cavity, and the lung expands with it. You have to have that fluid there. They have to be sticking together for that to work. On the inside, where we have alveoli, and if these are the cross-section through them, remember that their walls are about 1 cell thick. So this is supposed to be alveoli. Their walls are about 1 cell thick. And they should also have a thin layer, a very thin layer of fluid covering their inner surfaces. So there's air inside, there's a very thin layer of fluid covering that surface, and that is supposed to have surfactant. And that's the chemical that keep the walls alveolar is the word, alveolar walls from collapsing. So inner surface, you're supposed to have fluid with surfactant. It's almost like a detergent or a soap chemically. That's the one that babies lack to keep the air sacs from collapsing on themselves because they're so thin. And then on the outer surface of the whole lung, you're supposed to have the serous fluid that connects it to the chest wall. Both fluids are really important. And a disturbance in either fluid is going to disturb how the lung functions. Draw a circle right here around thin. Thin is good, thick is not. And we'll see why in just a minute. So that's going back and saying stuff I said last time, but with more writing and mediocre pictures for you to study. Something that was on the quiz last time. So was this on today's reading or last time's reading? Okay. I just wanted to check because I had it on the quiz last time, and a lot of you didn't know it on the quiz.
This is in the second set of slides.
It is in the second set of slides, but it was on the first reading. Your non-respiratory air movements, number one, they have to be coming out of, originating from the lungs. Like one of you tried and wrote fart on the quiz, and that is an air movement, but it's not having anything to do with the respiratory system. It made me laugh. But so when we have air coming out of the lungs for a reason other than just ventilation, that's a non-respiratory air movement. And a lot of times these have a function, and you're making air move for some reason, but it's not related to getting oxygen or eliminating CO2. So coughing and sneezing, those are to move foreign substances out of your upper airways. This set, it's not really known why people do this. The beneficial reasons for these are not quite known. There are a few people that try to study it. If you've heard that yawning increases oxygen to your brain, that's one of those things that, like, yeah, that sounds like totally reasonable, but it's not really borne out by evidence. It's not known why we yawn. All of those move air for an undefined reason. When we talk, we're moving air in a particular way for communication. So if you're heading toward occupational therapy, helping people learn how to talk is quite complicated. And the way that we sing, the way that we talk, the way that we make consonants and all that, it's very, very detailed, very important, but it's considered a non-respiratory air movement. So you don't need these to stay alive. They're helpful for other reasons. This is an unintentionally hilarious chart to me. Would you like to know the technical definition of a hiccup?
Yes.
Well, there you go. To me, the coolest things about hiccups is when you're pregnant, at a certain time you can see the fetus shake your stomach. Move on from there. So, fortunately, we don't have to think about breathing for it to happen. I think that would waste a lot of our brain power. Like, how could you ever learn anything if you had to remember to breathe every time? When you're panicking, you can remember to breathe. You can decide to take a deep breath, but if you stop thinking about it, your brain will take over those functions for you. So, your breathing is controlled by the nervous system. So when you see these pictures and they've got yellow lines connecting to the organ, those are motor neurons. So you have motor neurons connected to your diaphragm that tell it to contract. It's a muscle. And those are connecting back up into the brain stem. So your lower brain centers. Your medulla oblongata is containing centers that control breathing, and they're called the respiratory group neurons. They control contraction of your diaphragm. Your higher brain, so your conscious brain function, can interface with this. So you also have neurons coming down that can control voluntarily, I want to take a deep breath right now, or I want to hold my breath because I'm swimming. So you can override the involuntary control, but if you stop thinking about breathing, this will normally still continue for you. And remember, it's the phrenic nerve. Make a note again right here, cranial nerve 5, phrenic nerve is controlling your diaphragm. So I already said you can decide, you can override your brain's involuntary breathing centers. But the involuntary part, the part that you're not thinking about, it will also adjust your breathing without you realizing it based on other factors. So you have ways of sensing unconsciously, subconsciously, unconsciously, what is my blood oxygen and what is my blood CO2. Your brain has sensors that tell you that, even though you're not aware of it. So if your oxygen and CO2 levels are not correct, your brain will adjust your breathing to help you deal with that. If you're going into nursing or later go into medical care and people are breathing strangely fast and shallow, sometimes it's because their blood is too acidic. It's a signal. That's going to come up next week. Your brain also senses how much is your lung tissue stretching, and it won't let you burst your own lungs. That's helpful. Like you can take the biggest breath that you can. Your brain won't let you overstretch your lungs and burst them from the inside, because it senses that and puts a negative feedback to make you stop. This one we've talked about, your emotional state. So via sympathetic, parasympathetic divisions of your nervous system, that can control your breathing as well. So if you get nervous, if you're going to get up and give a speech and you feel like you can't breathe, your brain is doing that for you. It's getting you ready to run away, which is not helpful. It's time to give a speech or stand up and do something in front of people. If you raise your physical activity, you don't have to tell yourself to breathe more. Your brain controls that for you. So your breathing should naturally increase in rate and depth to go along with your physical activity. And all of this is controlled by having specific receptors that measure stretch. So stretchiness, the stretch amount, that's a mechanical receptor set that you have. And then the chemical ones, you have chemical receptors that detect how much oxygen, how much CO2 do I have right now. All of these things play into your involuntary branch of your nervous system controlling your breathing. But you can voluntarily, consciously override it for the most part. Okay, now we get into the most important part of today, which is about gas exchange. So this next section is going to be talking about how do internal, let's start with external, those functions of the respiratory system which are external and internal respiration, moving gases from blood to tissues and vice versa. That's gas exchange. So gas exchange is getting oxygen and CO2 across membranes and talking about why are they moving in the direction that they're moving. So far we talked about ventilation. How do we get air into and out of the lungs? Second big function is external respiration. How do we get gases between air and the blood in the lungs? The third is gas transport, which is later in this lecture. The fourth is internal respiration, which generally works the same way, getting gases moving across membranes. What are our major blood gases? Oxygen. That's one we care about. What's the other one that we care about? Carbon dioxide, yeah. So oxygen and carbon dioxide, they are gases. They're in our blood. We also have nitrogen in our blood. You know how nitrogen's in the air? It's in the blood too. We never talk about it because it doesn't seem to do anything. It's there, it doesn't do anything. Oxygen and CO2 are the gases we care about. And fortunately, for all life, oxygen and CO2 go through plasma membranes without any kind of help. So if you're a Harry Potter fan, which I totally am, and you remember the ghosts in the castle, they can go through walls. They don't need a password, they don't need a special door, they don't need a wand, they just go straight through the walls. That's how blood gases act. So they just go where they feel like going. And chemically, they do that because they're really small. They're really small. Oh my gosh, there they are. Are you having sympathetic nervous activity right now? You don't have to draw these gases in this class, but that's what they are. They're small, they're nonpolar. They whoosh right through a plasma membrane. So they can go where they want. Where they want to go is just down a concentration gradient. So they're going to move from where there is more of that to where there is less of that. They're going down their concentration gradient. So for example, oxygen, the right word, oxygen will diffuse from places with more oxygen to places with less oxygen. So it will move from high to low. It will spread out, it will diffuse. Same for CO2. Wherever they're in higher concentration, they will start to move to where there's less of them. They spread out, they diffuse. So, if we need gases to move, if we want them to move, we just need a concentration gradient. We don't have to do tricky things to get them to move. If there's a concentration gradient, and they are going through a thin and permeable region, they will move. So we'll look at a picture next of respiratory membrane, but that needs to be thin. So it needs to be thin and shorter distances are best. So diffusion works best when there's a thin region to diffuse through and you're not trying to go far. Okay, so that's what we need for diffusion of gases. Okay, now this picture. I really like this picture. This is a picture of respiratory membrane in the lungs. In the lungs. The red are red blood cells. They are moving through an alveolar capillary. So if we took just this part right here, this tube, and there's red blood cells coming through, that's an alveolar capillary. Look how little it is. These are having to squish to get through it. It is tiny. Okay? This is airspace, or the alveolar space. So we have oxygen and CO2 moving from here to here across this thickness. This is the respiratory membrane, and it's got 4 parts to it. And we're going from the air interior to the capillary. So over here, this is air. The alveolar epithelium is right here. So that would be the wall of the alveolus. It's so thin you can barely even see it on here. So it would be, over here would be one, over here would be one. The next thing is something called basement membrane. Basement membrane somewhat holds alveolus together with the capillaries. Like they just have just the smallest amount of connection. It's connective tissue, that basement membrane. That's shown in the yellow on here. So that's basement membrane, holding those two together. In amongst that is interstitial fluid. It's so small, you don't see a big depth of it, but it's there. So there's some fluid kind of surrounding this membrane and touching the next layer, which is capillary endothelium. Capillary wall. So if I were to rephrase this, air sac wall, connecting stuff, capillary wall, and fluid in between there. So the fluid goes through the basement membrane, the fluid touches both. Those are your layers. So in here, we've got blood. Over here, we've got air. So we need CO2 and oxygen to be diffusing through this stuff. The thicker the fluid, the harder to diffuse. We don't want to have big, thick layer of fluid in the lungs. That's pneumonia, or drowning, or something dire. So we need the layers to be thin. Okay, the second thing to understanding how gases move is they're just these measurements of how much oxygen, how much CO2 do we have in this area. And this looks scary, but don't be too put off by it. It's this same measurement we've seen before, millimeters of mercury. It's a pressure. It's a pressure. So the higher the pressure of a gas, the more of that gas there is. It's like a concentration. Okay, so we'll look at a picture of that in a second. If I say that oxygen goes from high concentration to low concentration, and then now I'm going to put numbers on with that. So if this concentration is 72 millimeters of mercury, and we would call that the pressure, partial pressure of oxygen is how we write it. And down here, the partial pressure of oxygen is 68 millimeters of mercury. Oxygen is going to go this way, diffuse from high to low, and it will do that until these balance out. So what would the balanced out number be? It depends on, like, well, how big is this place and how big is this place? I'm not going to write a balanced out number. But it would diffuse until these equal out. Did you have a Coke today? A Coke. Coke can. When you pop a tab on a Coke can, they go psh. That sound that you hear is CO2 coming out of the can because it's been bottled up in there. It's coming out into the air. And if you let it sit there, it eventually will get not fizzy anymore. Because all of the CO2 that's dissolved in the liquid making it fizzy will eventually go into the air where it's at lower concentration, and it will go to equilibrium, and then it's not fizzy.
Well, I saw this one video about a man working in a water facility, and the water pressure was so high, when he shook up the can of Coke and everything, it didn't spread out, it just
It was underwater?
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Underwater? No. It's underwater lab.
Uh-huh.
He shook up the Coke as hard as he could, opened it, but it didn't spread out or anything.
Like he was in a submarine or something?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
I'm like,
It's kind of scary.
because apparently the pressure was greater or equal to the Coke, so that's why it didn't spread out.
He would have had to come up slowly from that place. He'd get the bends. On this slide, just draw a line through this. When I first started teaching this class, I asked students to calculate partial pressures, and then later I thought, maybe like one person a year might ever need to do that after this class, coming out of this class. So I don't need you to find the pressures. I'm just going to list them for you and you need to know like which one's bigger, which way is this gas going to move. Draw a circle on here though. Gases diffuse between air and liquid. So to a gas, it doesn't so much make a difference that, okay, right now I'm in the air and right now I'm in the water. They're still going to diffuse from air to water or water to air. So see, bubbles coming out of a Coke, that's gas going from liquid to air. If I bring in here a container of water, and I set it right here, and then I brought in an oxygen tank, and I opened it up, and there's more oxygen in the room, that extra oxygen will also go into the water. So gas, water, that's not really a barrier to diffusion for these gases. So now we come to, oh my gosh, this looks like one of those capillary bed pictures. It is one of those capillary bed pictures. We're just talking about pulmonary capillaries now. And it's got a lot of numbers, and it's got a lot of arrows, so we're going to go slowly through this. This is a picture of external respiration because we are looking at lungs. Here would be the wall of an alveolus right here. So this is lungs. There's air in here. This capillary is going right next to it, so this is a pulmonary capillary. So we're looking at external respiration. Gas is moving from air to the blood in the lungs. This is external respiration. And we could draw on here. Here comes the blood. It's actually coming from the heart. It's coming from the right side of the heart. And further back in time, it's coming from the body tissue. So it's coming in with lower oxygen and higher CO2. By the time the blood passes by the airspace, if everything is working properly, when it's heading back to the heart, it's got more oxygen than it had, right? So we can see that as it's more blue here, it's more red over here. Let's write some extra on here. So blood that's coming in from the tissues has lower oxygen. That means concentration. Lower oxygen concentration, higher CO2 concentration. Blood that is heading back to the heart, if this is working well, make this exactly match. It has higher oxygen concentration and lower CO2 concentration. That's what's supposed to happen. That's what's supposed to happen. And now, when you see the numbers, don't worry so much about the unit. There are numbers associated with that. So the numbers mean that's a concentration of that gas at that point. So when the blood came in, it had 40 oxygen. It's not 40%, it's 40. That's just a value. When the blood leaves, whoa, it's got 104. That's so much better. Not 104%, but 104 is just the level. So it's picked up a lot of oxygen. What about CO2? It came in at a concentration of 45. Oh, it left at a concentration of 40. That's not that big of a drop. These are the realistic numbers. So now let's look at the air part. Remember, the air in your lungs is connected to the outside air. So the air numbers, these numbers represent what's normal for the air of our world, which is the air of your lungs. So this would be people breathing normal air, not on oxygen tank, not on anything special, just normal air. Oh, these match this. If everything's working well, these match this. How'd they get this way? I shouldn't have erased that. Because it went to equilibrium. It went to equilibrium. So when the blood comes past, oxygen is lower here than here. Oxygen diffuses this way. Does that seem okay? Oxygen is high in your lung air compared to the blood that is passing by here right now. So oxygen diffuses this way. The blood that is passing by here right now, it's got more CO2 than the lung air, so CO2 diffuses out overall that way. Now we need to draw something else in here. Okay, make a little thing like this, some kind of drawing like this, and say that's the respiratory membrane. There's our respiratory membrane. So we've got the wall of the alveolus, 1 cell thick. The wall of the capillary, which they don't really have this to scale, but that would be right here. There's a basement membrane and fluid in between. That's where gases are supposed to be moving across. It ought to be short, it ought to be thin. If you have a lot of fluid in here, the gases cannot go to equilibrium. Maybe they can't move well at all. That's dangerous. You need it to be thin so that gases can diffuse from high to low concentration. Seem okay? And then I have on there, where do these numbers come from? Let's see what the next slide is. I'll come back to the where do they come from in a minute. Okay, so these pictures look the same. They actually are the same. Your book doesn't have a separate picture to show what happens in the tissue cells, which is lame. But I am saying this is now in the body cells. This is now in the body cells. So just imagine these are some other cells in your body. We are now not talking about the respiratory membrane. We're not talking about the respiratory membrane. We're talking about something else. So out here, here's your bloodstream capillaries. And again, I made this picture up. I couldn't switch the colors. This blood's coming from the lungs. I made the numbers right. It looks blue. It wouldn't really be blue, it would be red. This is the blood going back to the lungs. So this would be a capillary in the systemic circulation. The capillary of the systemic circulation. And remember when we saw the picture of the horse's hoof and the capillary bed looked just like the shape of a hoof? And I said that capillaries have to get close to every cell in the body. They have to get close to every cell in the body so that gases can get into those cells over a short distance. So same kind of thing, but now oxygen and CO2 are going to move in different ways. So in the cells, we have lower oxygen and we have higher CO2 than the blood that is coming out of your aorta and through all your blood vessels. The blood that is coming here is high in oxygen from the lungs. And it's lower in CO2 because it just left the lungs, basically. And it's coming out to the tissues. Now we start talking about why. Why do the body cells have such low oxygen? What's their problem?
Because they already used it up.
They're using it up, yes. They have lower oxygen because they're using it in aerobic respiration. What is oxygen doing in aerobic respiration? Why do you need oxygen for life?
So it can be used as energy.
It's related to energy. You've got to have it at the end of the electron transport chain. A place to put electrons. So if you're alive, you're using oxygen and your cells are always using it up. They should not be taking breaks. They should not be using a little bit less today. They're always using it up. That's why it's low. We've got higher CO2 because we're producing it during glycolysis and during Krebs cycle. Also during aerobic respiration. So we're making CO2 all the time if we're using sugar. We're making CO2. So if the body cells are healthy and normal, they're always using up oxygen. They're always producing excess of CO2. So if the blood that is passing by here has this level of oxygen, body cells have low oxygen. Oxygen moves into them by diffusion. This is actually more simple than the pictures make it look. Oxygen goes into the cells because they're always using oxygen. And CO2 will go into the blood because this blood that's passing by has lower CO2 level. And notice when the blood leaves here, oh, it's equilibrated. So when the blood leaves the area, it's equilibrated. The numbers have balanced. See how that works? Like everything is shifted here, diffused as much as it can. It's gone to equilibrium, it's balanced when the blood leaves. And you could draw an arrow back from this back to the previous slide. Oh, it's leaving the tissues at 40 oxygen and 45 CO2. It's going to stay about the same until it gets back to the lungs. Make another note about these two slides. About the way that this gas exchange works. Gas exchange happens in capillary beds. Gas exchange happens in capillary beds. Once you get out of the capillary beds and you get into a bigger blood vessel, the wall of the blood vessel is too thick for oxygen to really go very far out of that. So the main movers of gases, it's in your lung capillaries and in your systemic capillaries. That's where the gas concentrations are going to change, in those two places. In external respiration, and this is internal respiration. How do you feel? Do you need some deep breaths? You need more oxygen to your brain? That's half the hard part. Okay, the next hard part is about gas transport. This is the part where we're on function 3, transporting gases around the body. This is happening in the bloodstream. So your bloodstream is moving blood through these locations. And we had said that the gas exchange part, that's in the capillaries. But you still do have these blood gases in all the blood of your body, and they're found in different forms. So we start with oxygen. The oxygen in your blood is mostly carried around on hemoglobin. That protein in red blood cells, and it requires iron. It binds oxygen, and so when oxygen is in the blood, it's mostly riding around on hemoglobin. Like if you go to elementary school, say that you go to like a big city elementary school, and most of the kids come there on the bus, and then there's like 3 that walk. Kind of like that. So you have a little bit of oxygen dissolved in the plasma, but most of it's on hemoglobin. For carbon dioxide, it has a more variety of transport options. Here's a word, carbaminohemoglobin. Carbaminohemoglobin. What that is hemoglobin that's bound to CO2 and not oxygen. If hemoglobin is a bus, they're integrated. They can carry both blood gases. People just don't learn about this one as early on. So, of the CO2 in your blood, 23% of it is on hemoglobin. Where's the rest? 7% of it is just dissolved in plasma as CO2. It's like so many crashing today. Earthquakes in there. We're only up to 30%. The rest of the CO2 is in a particularly important form called bicarbonate. Bicarbonate. So we've got 70% of all the CO2 that's in your blood is actually in the form of a chemical called bicarbonate. If you're in exercise phys, or you're going into nursing, you're going to be sick of hearing about bicarbonate, but it's really, really important. It's really important. We're getting to next, why is it important? Here's why that's important. Your CO2 levels that are in your blood, no matter what form it's writing in, the CO2 levels in your blood lower your blood pH. Another way that you could say this is the more CO2 in the blood, the more acidic the blood is. If you just memorize one thing that I say today, CO2 in your blood acidifies your blood. Does that mean it's going to make your blood pH go down or up? Down. So, more acidity, lower pH. Let's write that too. Lower pH. Why? Now we talk about why. In the space under why, I'm going to be writing this equation out here, but in a straight line. I don't like this angled line thing. And this is an equation I want you to memorize as well. So, make a note, memorize, and be able to write this. CO2, carbon dioxide, when it's with water, when it's dissolved in water, it forms a chemical called carbonic acid. We'll go back and write the words with this in a minute. H2CO3, carbonic acid. You don't have to do anything special to get this to happen. The Coke in the can, you heard that Cokes are bad for your teeth because they're acid. This is why. They're not putting in extra acid. It's the fizziness with the water, it makes acid. This acid tends to fall apart and make those two chemicals. Which is proton, acid, H+, and bicarbonate. So let's go back and write in the words. I want you to memorize the equation, like with everything correct, also the words. So this one, carbon dioxide, this is water. You probably already know those two. This one is called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid. This one you can call it a proton or you can call it just acid, because acid is H plus, acid is protons. This one is bicarbonate. So, when we say that 70% of all the CO2 in your blood is found in the form of bicarbonate, it was momentarily dissolved in the water in your plasma. It formed carbonic acid. Carbonic acid falls apart easily into these two versions, and thus that's where the CO2 went. It formed this bicarbonate in this way. This is a nice equation. Like, you don't have to, there's no numbers of molecules, all one of everything. Part of the next exam, you have to write this for the A part of a question. Write it, name it, and then you use that to answer other questions. Okay, now we come back to our cartoon picture. Okay, so here's a capillary down here. Here's a red blood cell squished down to fit. Here's airspace. Here's airspace. So this is showing just stuff for CO2. So there's CO2 that's dissolved in the plasma, and it can go straight across the respiratory membrane and diffuse here to here. CO2 that is in the form of bicarbonate, it's not bicarbonate that diffuses across. Bicarbonate cannot diffuse across, it's a gas. So when blood is passing by an area where CO2 is lower on the other side, this equation will go backwards. This equation will go backward. Please tell me I did not just erase everything that was good. Okay. I'll show that in a minute. This will go backward, and it's CO2 that gets released out of this equation and then diffuses into the blood. CO2 that's sitting on a hemoglobin seat can just jump off. It's not in a different version. So that's how CO2 moves out of the blood and into the air in your lungs. Okay, make a note now on this that we wrote on this slide. Make a note. If you have extra CO2, that's going to lead to extra acid. Got extra CO2 in the blood. It reacts with water. It's going to lead to extra acid. This is the physiological acid right here. If you have less CO2, as in you're in a place where it can diffuse away, that's going to pull this equation in this direction so that you remove acid. If more CO2 is leaving out of your lungs, that pulls the equation balance in this direction and you remove acid. That's the most complicated concept in this whole chapter. Write something else about this. Normally the way that this is happening is that you blow off, when you exhale CO2, you are pulling acid out of your body. Every breath you take, every move you make, deacidifies you. Every breath you blow out removes acid from your body in this way.
I'm just thinking about like
Extra credit. Make a video. No.
I'm thinking about Linkin Park now.
Every breath that you don't breathe out, you're leaving CO2 and it's making you more acidic. So if you're not breathing right, you're gonna, if you're breathing and something's going on with your breathing, it's gonna change the acidity of your blood. When people hyperventilate, they actually get rid of too much acid, and that's what causes them to pass out. It's not, they don't have an oxygen problem, it's a CO2 problem. It's a blood pH thing. You know, like little kids can hold their breath because they're so mad. And if they're very strong-willed, they'll hold their breath until they pass out. Their brain eventually senses, oh, the blood's too acidic, pass out. When they pass out, they can, you know, they involuntarily start breathing again. It's this acid stuff. So breathing is connected to blood acidity in this particular way. Let's make one more set of notes. Can you tell this is an important slide? This is an important slide. Let's use a better visible marker. How about a brown marker? If you can't expel CO2, you will end up with too much acid in your blood. If you expel too much CO2, you will have too little acid, and your blood will be too basic. Your blood will be too basic. And it's because of this bicarbonate system. This is also known as bicarbonate buffer system. Or people may call it bicarb buffer. So your levels of bicarbonate are very important for helping your body balance blood pH. I know this is intense stuff. You need this to understand blood pH. You can't understand blood pH without understanding this stuff. This is the most important slide right here. Not just for today, but for this whole entire unit. If I had to pick out one slide, it's that. This is just a review. This is a review. How do blood gases travel in the blood? So for oxygen, it's riding around on hemoglobin, jumps on and off the bus, doesn't change forms. CO2, some of it